So hello, welcome, Headlocks and Headphones, me, Martin Anderson, minus the glasses this week so you don't get the glare of the computer, which was something I was really frustrated with in last week's video. This week we are doing something slightly different. We're not going to be looking at modern wrestling, we're going to be looking at something classic. We're going to be exploring the idea of the first Monday Nitro, and my producer Zoe Styles has sat and done her homework, she's watched through the episode, but hopefully by the end of it, we will have a better understanding of what made the first Nitro so special and what made people invest in that show for 5 years, at least most of that 5 years. One of the quite interesting things is that whilst we're not going to talk about modern wrestling, let's explore the Forgotten Sons debut on SmackDown. The Revival have been released from their WWE contracts. They were on SmackDown. WWE is still going ahead with shows. They're no longer pre-taping them. They're going to be doing them live. WWE are classing themselves as essential media, which is baffling as far as I'm concerned. And in addition to that, one of the things that's quite interesting right now is that AEW is going to be continuing doing their shows behind closed doors. But they've filmed 6 weeks worth and they're giving their guys time off. From what I understand, leaks are very slim. If you're not going out of your way to find them, you won't get the results of what happened there. The internet age is one thing that is great for us. We can keep in contact during this lockdown, but it's really bad if you want to try and keep something in wrestling secret. Now that brings me to something I want to talk about. Normally on the podcast, what we do is we give you something to watch every week. It's not homework, although it kind of is. We tell you something that's wrestling related that you can go out there and watch. Now we try and make sure we can find something for free. We have in the past had, Secrets of the Ring, we've had shoot interviews, we've had Beyond the Mat, a documentary that followed Mick Foley, and we've had an NWA documentary, and these were all available on YouTube. We wanted to make sure everybody could go out there and see it. This week, I'm saying go out of your way to sign up for the WWE Network, because wrestling's going away for a wee bit, at least that's how it looks. Most of the indies are not running anything. WWE and AEW do have some form of filming schedule, but go out of your way to get some of the older stuff. Even if you don't want to support WWE, support the other companies. Go sign up for Impact, go sign up for any of the indie companies that you like, and make sure that they have money to see through the lockdown and get to the other side and still provide us with the wrestling that we love so much. Because you know what, as much as we want to say that WWE is the biggest show, AEW is trying to be something different, if you look back just a couple of years, Ring of Honor, for example, one of the companies which has been largely mismanaged for a few years, has now been taken over by one of the more exciting talents from the United Kingdom, Marty Scurll. And one of the interesting things that he's discovered is that he was popular enough to be able to request to be the head booker. So he's been able to make some changes. But if we rewind just a little bit to when Ring of Honor was actually just newly acquired by Sinclair, and there was quite a lot of change happening in the company, you actually saw the likes of Tyler Black, Bryan Danielson, Kevin Steen, Chris Hero, and quite a lot of other guys in there that, to be honest, are actually the main event of WWE, and it's a scary thing to look at. But since the first episode of ROH on HDNet, Daniel Bryan has been retired and come back. Seth Rollins, who was Tyler Black, has headlined WrestleMania and been out injured and come back and had the fans turn on him. Kevin Owens, of course, has come along as the WWE alter ego of Kevin Steen. He hasn't changed his body shape, but he's probably more over now than he was when he was in Ring of Honor. Now, we're not talking about Ring of Honor today. We are going to be talking about the first ever episode of WCW Monday Nitro. The first in a series where we're going to talk with my producer Zoe Styles, who happens to be my wife. And we're going to talk about the firsts. We're going to talk about the first Monday Nitro, the first ECW under the WWE banner, although we'll talk more about how that's a bit of a grey area about when it was under the WWE banner. We are going to look at some other first episodes of things just to see what it's like. The great thing for me is I married somebody 10 years younger than me. Now, I'm not bragging, right? But because she's 10 years younger, a lot of things are quite new. Now, since she got together with me, she's been forced to watch wrestling. Wrestling is kind of a big part of our lives. It's everywhere. If I look, there is, of course, as you saw briefly in the previous episode, we do have belts littered around the house. Literally littered around the house. So, big fans. Problem? There's only so many hours in the day, so if you haven't sat and watched Nitro from the start, like I have, and like I know several people have, we enjoyed going back and looking at these things. We actually, many of us downloaded them from torrents and went out of our way to watch them. Today they're on the WWE Network, with some of the music changed, which is a little bit frustrating, but the original episodes of Monday Nitro were 1 hour long, and the first episode was on September the 4th, 1995. Now, I don't want to cross over with a lot of the research and extra little tidbits that my producer is going to add into this. However, a couple of interesting pieces of trivia for you. So the reason that Nitro started was because Vince McMahon had basically tried to move towards a younger generation of talent. You saw Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, Big Boss Man, several others kind of gravitate away from WCW, from WWF to WCW, as they noticed that there was a bit of a change in the landscape. Also attracted by the big bucks that WCW were offering to people. And one of the interesting parts about this is that the ratings didn't really rise all that much. Pay-per-view numbers for Hogan's first pay-per-view match went up. The match against Ric Flair was a big success. But beyond that, the ratings didn't really budge. So Ted Turner, curious, how do we actually improve and compete against WWF? Eric Bischoff didn't expect that. So the first thing he thought of was to blurt out, give me Monday nights. We have to run against them. And Ted Turner turned around to the flunky that he had and said, give Ted an hour every Monday night. And then that hour became 2, and that 2 became 3, and then there was a Thursday show, and then... So WCW really did kind of... They needed Nitro to be able to succeed, because without it, ratings weren't budging. 6:05, WCW Saturday Night Show, it was what it was. You had WCW Pro on a Sunday, you had several other things floating around. Bear in mind, the UK schedule is a little bit different, so even when Nitro started, we didn't have TNT here. So what we had was the Cartoon Network would end at 7 o'clock, and then we would actually get Nitro on a Friday, and then later on Bravo picked it up, and then obviously Channel 5 picked up a weird abomination of it looked like Batman from the 60s, and that's not a compliment for the shows that they were broadcasting. They were horrible. But one of the things that's quite interesting, when WCW launched, they spent quite a lot of time trying to make it look a little bit different to Monday Night Raw. Monday Night Raw had been on the air for 2 years, so they had the ability to go live, they had the ability to pre-tape, and they were unopposed. They didn't really have anything. And that's what's quite interesting when we look at Monday Nitro. September the 4th, 1995, the first episode of Monday Nitro. It came from the Mall of America in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and there were some really big matches on there. When you look back on them, there's a lot of Hall of Famers on that first show. But it's only an hour. It's very tight, very compact. And one of the interesting pieces of trivia, just for the people who like trivia, is that it was unopposed. There was no Raw that night. In fact, the next week, I believe, there was no Raw either. It was preempted, likely for the dog show. It sometimes still happened up to a few years ago. So Nitro had a unique ability for those people who were flicking through trying to find Raw. They wouldn't find it. They'd flick a few channels either way, and they might stumble upon Nitro, and WCW could get some new fans. Great idea. They picked the perfect week to try and hook people. They had filmed, obviously, their opening sequence before the show went to air, and they didn't really have much time to edit things out. So what they did have was Hulk Hogan, Sting, Randy Savage, and a man called Vader. Vader, of course, would go on to be in WCW for several years after a career in Japan. He would then make his way to WWF. And a show I'm watching on Disney Plus just now called Boy Meets World. He had several cameos in there, kind of as the transition period from WCW to WWF was happening. So WCW did have some mainstream pull. They were out there. They were getting some notoriety, especially with the addition of Hulk Hogan. But what impact would Monday Nitro have for WCW? What matches would be on the show that would make people intrigued to tune in the next week? And more importantly, why did WCW become the #1 show in wrestling in America? Globally, it's arguable that WWF were still the #1 because they still had a much bigger market in the UK and Europe, and they still had some reach over in Japan. Whereas WCW, every week it seemed to change whether they were in a relationship with New Japan Pro Wrestling. Kind of like, they were like young people in a relationship. You just never know what was happening. So, this is what is happening today. The show is not about modern wrestling. We are going to be discussing Monday Nitro episode 1. Next week, we will have another episode 1, which we haven't decided. ECW under the WWE banner. What else? There's quite a lot of them. If you have any suggestions that you would like to give us, then send us a message kind of on here. I can't remember where the bits are, but send us a message on Facebook, Headlocks and Headphones. Send us a message here on YouTube. Add a comment underneath, because we do see them. And one of the interesting things is, if you want to be involved, if you want to be interviewed, if you want to just come on and talk about something wrestling related you have an opinion on, then get in touch. Headlocks and Headphones. You'll find us on Facebook. The video tells you to find us on Facebook, but I'm assuming you already have, because you're here. So, in a first here for Headlocks and Headphones, I am joined by my producer, Zoe Styles. Say hello, Zoe.
Hello. I would wave, but given last version of the jazz hands, I don't think I will.
I honestly do not like jazz hands, particularly when they're connected to Kenny Omega. We're going to avoid talk of Kenny Omega. We're going to talk about something that's actually really fun. So, you're 10 years younger than me. You've never seen the first episode of Nitro before we did this. Is that right?
I didn't see the whole one. I think I saw clips here and there, because you were all like, oh, it was filmed in a mall. And I'm like, what?
Yeah, I mean, it's cool. They filmed it in a mall. Who does that? That's like going to the Bonaccord Centre here in Aberdeen and they suddenly have wrestling in the centre. Okay, they can't do it anymore because it's now a coffee shop, but that's what it was like.
I miss the glass elevators. See, imagine having a wrestling show with those glass elevators.
You actually have those at the Mall of America. So the thing that you're saying that you miss here in Aberdeen, Scotland, is the thing that they had there. They also have a mall that's so big that it takes you like 2 days to go into every shop. Which, when you compare it to many other places, it's just insane that Minneapolis has this. Minneapolis, of course, Eric Bischoff has his ties to Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's AWA territory, which is where Eric Bischoff got his start. But one of the interesting things here is that WCW was in need of something to kind of spark the ratings, because they had the talent, they had the Hogans, they had Big Boss Man, they had Randy Savage, guys who had main evented WrestleManias. But what they didn't have was people willing to tune in every week to see these guys. The WWF didn't have a very adult-orientated product either. So that, by all accounts, was Eric Bischoff's mantra here, is let's take everything WWF is and let's be different. Every time there's something in the rule book, let's tear up the rule book and let's go with it. One of the things I want to point out, that mantra inspired a writer from New York called Vince Russo. So, as much as certain people don't like Vince Russo, Eric Bischoff is one of them, obviously, but as much as they don't like him, one of the interesting things is they are the reason for him being there. Because without Nitro, you would have no Vince Russo.
I think one of the things that really stood out for me about Nitro was, as you say, those significant style changes. I mean, I've written some notes, and some of my bullet points are, oh, this is different, that is different. I mean, I've been a wrestling fan for about 8 years now, and to be honest, I've mostly watched the WWE product. I haven't really spanned out.
We have seen some other stuff. You've seen some Shikara. We have watched New Japan Pro Wrestling shows together. You've watched AEW for the podcast most weeks. So you have got a very different wrestling knowledge. And one of the things that's quite interesting is you have a background in psychology. You have studied psychology at a certain level. So you have an appreciation for some of the finer points of wrestling, which is great. It's something hopefully we can maybe get into as we're going along here. But one of the interesting points that I have when you're looking at something for the first time is you're looking for something to grab your attention and for you not to keep going, oh, they did something there I didn't like. So the worst debut we've ever watched was the new World of Sport content for the ITV. Yes, I can tell from the facial expression. Would you like to tell people why you disliked World of Sport when it debuted?
It may be a generational thing, because obviously, as you said, I'm 10 years younger than yourself. But for me, with the camera cuts in World of Sport, it felt as though every few minutes it would move. And it's perhaps because I've got a shorter attention span, I couldn't really say. But when you're watching it, I want the content that I can follow. I want to understand the story. If there's something dramatic that happens, someone gets thrown through a table, someone goes over the barricade, then yes, absolutely. Cut away to that and then make it a point.
Well, see, what WWE just now, they have an issue where they seem to have a camera change on the beats. So, you know, like when there's a big impact move, the camera angle changes. And it's a psychological thing. It's designed to make you feel like something more is happening. But at the same time, when it's WWE, it's also designed to hide the flaws. So if somebody doesn't quite get all of a drop kick, live you can switch the camera angle so you get a better shot. One of the things with Nitro at this point, because live wrestling had only really been done as, you know, a 1 hour special every now and again, or pay-per-view, which even back in 95 still wasn't live all the time. There were still times where they pre-taped the pay-per-views. There was no internet to spoil it. And with Dave Meltzer having a deadline that meant that, you know, you could record on a Thursday and show it on the Sunday, and Meltzer wouldn't be able to spoil it in his newsletter. We really are, if we are sitting down right now and it's 1995, we are in a very interesting time, because we are at this point where wrestling is needing to grow beyond what it is. I'm maybe a fan of this guy, but you know, Duke the Dumpster Drosy is not selling 80,000 tickets. But at the same time, people needed to take a risk, and they had a billionaire who had a TV network that was willing to back them up. So on that note, we're both going to have it on in the background with the volume turned off, so that when we talk about it, we're also going to talk about your notes, and we're going to try and talk about wrestling on the way. So, are you ready to go?
I am, though I do just want to say, on the note of Duke the Dumpster Drosy, fantastic guy, sent me an autographed bin lid.
Which I believe is in the room that we're in right now. Well, the room that I'm in. But it's over there and I'll fall over because I'm getting old. Right, so.
It's big and it's steel and it's great and I love it.
Exactly. It's one of those weird random things you get when you're a wrestling collector. Right, so you ready to start your episode?
Yes, got it right here.
3, 2, 1, go. Now, if you are watching this podcast, you can always side window 2 versions of video and have the network, where you will see Vader is actually in the opening credits here.
I just showed up.
I did
see that the first time I watched it.
Part of the story is quite interesting in the sense that Vader had that fight with Paul Orndorff, where Paul Orndorff apparently was in flip-flops, and Vader's a big scary dude, and Paul Orndorff got him on the ground and beat him up. So it's quite interesting to see some of the stuff that happens when it comes to wrestlers and how they kind of, I know they're all meant to be tough guys, but I don't think all of them are. If you are watching along, Steve Mongo McMichael, who just a few months beforehand had actually been at WrestleMania, and he had been, he was one of the friends of the NFL star who was in the main event against Bam Bam Bigelow. The arrival of Bobby Heenan for a WWF fan tuning into this. There's enough here for them to go, wait a minute, I know Bobby Heenan, and WWF isn't on the other side. I know who Bobby Heenan is, and without giving spoilers, knowing what the first match is going to be is insane. That it's Brian Pillman and Jushin Thunder Liger.
I was quite surprised when I was watching it that there was a ton of guys in this episode that I didn't know were in WCW, like Macho Man. When he came on the screen, I had no idea he was there, and I genuinely popped out my seat and went, "Oh, that's Macho Man! Love that guy."
And that's one of the things. I mean, what happened with Savage was he was told he was just going to be an announcer in WWF, and Vince McMahon said to him, "Listen, like we're going with the new generation." He'd had his match against Crush at WrestleMania, and he was at a Survivor Series not long after. The problem is that I just don't think he was happy just being a commentator. He wanted to be in the ring and wrestling, and you can see he had about another 4 years in WCW, and he was in the main event, involved with the NWO, involved with all the big storylines.
And rightly so as well. I think there is in the past quite a lot of commentators who've sat and went, you know what, I don't want to be on the commentary team. I want to be out there. I want to be wrestling.
I mean, one of the things, if you are watching, you'd have just seen the big sign behind there, which is WCW, where the big boys play. For a company that would build Nitro around cruiserweights, who are all the small guys, it's not about size. And that's one of the things. The big boys is not about the size of the person there. It's about the fact that it's meant to be big stars. And WCW certainly, for a while, they set the tone. This is a cruiserweight match to open up. Brian Pillman and Jushin Thunder Liger had actually had matches in the early 90s, so about 4 years before this, where Pillman was fighting for, I believe it was the light heavyweight championship, or it wasn't the cruiserweight title at that point, I don't think. But that division was built around the likes of Jushin Thunder Liger coming in for TV tapings here and there. Somebody who was based on one of my favorite TV shows, the Power Rangers. Mm-hmm. The costumes and outfits, I believe, are reminiscent of the family of shows that was an inspiration for Power Rangers. So one of the interesting things here is, at this point, you can see the fans aren't really reacting in the way that wrestling fans would. So why do you think these fans at this show are not reacting the way we would see Attitude Era fans react to Stone Cold Steve Austin?
I think a lot of them aren't there for the wrestling show. I mean, I know they've perhaps sold tickets for that show, but a lot of them will be passerby. I mean, one of the things that I noted whilst watching it was the escalators in the background.
Yeah, I mean, people are shopping.
Yeah, 20 or 30 people on those escalators just going up and down and just nosying, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great place. Sorry, it's a great place to put some of your best talent out there. Bit of a bot if you're watching the episode. Bit of a botch there from Pillman and Liger, but it didn't come across all that badly at all. It's quite interesting to see that one of the things WCW were always worried about was the aesthetics. So they had the big iron WCW letters that came along quite soon after this, and it was quite interesting that WCW were concerned about making themselves look different to WWF. This show doesn't have the same, prim and proper look about it that you would expect from a billion-dollar company.
I think what caught me off guard as a more modern fan was the lack of hard cam. I mean, there is one that kind of sits there, but it wavers as well. And there's just
there's no, as well.
There's no it was something that actually put me off a little bit. Again, like you say, with the world of sport, where you're kind of watching it, and then all of a sudden there's a different angle, and you're looking, going, no, just I want to see what's happening. I don't want to be chopping and changing all the time.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things we see in Nitro is they would open with cruiserweights, which is what they did in the first episode, and then the older talent would be at the end of the show. And it's quite interesting that people like Chris Jericho have said the problem is that those at the start of the show are meant to be built so that they can move towards the end of the show. But all that really happened was those that were older would not give up their spots. And the interesting thing is a lot of this content has never really been seen in American companies before. In the big dive off the side of the ring onto Pillman. I mean, by that day's standards, that's a holy shit moment, and the fans didn't care. I think for a lot of these fans, like you said, they're not wrestling fans. They're just people who were there shopping.
They perhaps even necessarily know that it's wrestling. It's maybe just theatrics, perhaps.
And the thing is, a lot of people watching this back might say, there wasn't a lot of story in the first hour. But if you look at how they ended Nitro, they almost bookended it. So the last episode of Nitro actually had Ric Flair versus Sting, just like we will see later on.
I thought there was some fantastic back and forth in that match. I mean, it's clear the two of them are stood going, right, so who's got the bigger guns? And it is one move here, one move there. You've got a little bit of extra. Oh, ouch. That was Pillman into the turnbuckle.
Yeah, so this is one of those things, like nowadays, we look at things like a superplex as almost a throwaway move. And you look at Nitro back then, and there's still a belief at that point that things could actually end off a superplex. We're near enough back in time where that's a thing.
I'll be honest. See, when I saw Liger's reverse surfboard, I did sit in awe and go, "Ow!" Like, not gonna take in that.
From a dive from the top rope there, it was very impressive.
Yeah. What I really like about this as well with WCW is that the ref isn't interfering too much. He's at the side, he counts a little bit, he pulls off if necessary, but he's not running the match.
I mean, that's the thing that's quite interesting for me as well, is WCW had some great referees over the years. Now, I believe the referee in the ring there is Nick Patrick, who would later go on to join the NWO. And I believe, if my trivia is correct, that his father is actually somebody very important in wrestling as well. I'm going to double check that just to make sure I'm not giving out some duff information. But yeah, what's interesting is Jushin Thunder Liger's only just retired. Seeing the picture of him looking at the mirror with his mask off when he retired, it's just one of those. When Jushin Thunder Liger showed up in NXT, I remember saying to you, like, this is a guy to be excited about. He might be old, but like he just imagines that he's never going to be wrestling again, so he needs to show you everything he's got.
To be honest, when the announcement went up, my heart went into my chest because I thought, oh no, what's happened to him?
Yeah, at least it was just a retirement. But yeah. Nick Patrick's dad is Jody Hamilton, who is the assassin. Jody Hamilton at one point was he founded Deep South Wrestling, which was actually the second developmental alongside Ohio Valley Wrestling, which was run by Jim Cornette. Deep South were the ones that had Bill DeMott in there. Big victory for Brian Pillman, who, of course, was a horseman before he left WCW. And the commentator at ringside, Steve Mongo McMichael, would go on to be a horseman as well. It was quite interesting for Steve Mongo McMichael, however, in that he would sometimes disappear because he liked to drink. So he definitely fit in with a horseman if he liked to drink. But his wife at the time was Deborah McMichael, who would go on to be Deborah Jeff Jarrett's valet in WWF. There was a small feud between her and Woman in the Four Horsemen, and there was also the fact that Deborah married Stone Cold Steve Austin. As we talk over the replay of Brian Pillman with the roll up, which you don't see roll ups anymore.
I love that that's at the end of the match, though. There's no cutaway mid-match to say, oh, look what happened here 30 seconds ago when you were still watching. You would have understood if it was like an ad break and they came back in and said, this is what happened during the ad, can't believe you missed it.
I'm a huge fan of the aesthetics here of Nitro. This fire, so they changed the introduction every now and again. So we obviously opened up with like Vader and everybody on the walls. When NWO come along, it became more of kind of what we're seeing now in lockdown, where the streets were empty and the drain covers were blowing up in the air. There was fire everywhere. I mean, if you weren't a wrestling fan and you tuned in, you'd be seeing that intro and thinking something incredible. I can see that smile. I know you're looking at Pastamania, brother.
Exactly that. To be honest, that's exactly what I thought. The show's on mute, but I looked up, I saw Hogan, and my brain instantly went, Pastamania.
Brother. And it's amazing to think, here's a guy who's been around this long. That restaurant was nothing to do with WCW. That restaurant was nothing to do with Hulk Hogan. He didn't run it. But they gave him money to use his name, and it stayed open for a little while and then disappeared. Another one of those ventures.
What I quite liked about it was that it's a classic Hogan promo. You know that it starts up, you know he throws in brother, he hypes the background, and he gets everybody involved. I mean, you can see the smile on Bischoff's face, and you know that we can't wait to see what he says next.
I mean, the one thing I would say about this that I think Bischoff would be frustrated about as well is the fact that, okay, the focus is meant to be on Hogan, but what we're looking at right now is Hogan, the world title, and Eric Bischoff's ear.
And then the person beside the world title.
Yeah, Jimmy Hart. It's a very strange aesthetic to see, and now obviously this is what we want. This is the thing that we're paying to see, if you will. It's Hulk Hogan.
Yeah,
I like
the background colors match Hogan's colors as well. You know, the red, the yellow. I didn't notice that the first time around, but looking at it just now, they've even got a tiny Hogan up in the top corner.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that building is really impressive. They've been able to shoot some of the WCW logos onto the walls and stuff. I mean, this is a building that's incredible, and they've picked something totally unique. So anybody who tunes into WWF the week before and then tunes into this is going to be thoroughly shocked. Particularly if you're a WWF fan and all of a sudden you see Ric Flair, the Nature Boy, and he comes out wearing that gold robe in the Mall of America, and he's about to have a match against Sting, the person that he personally handmade in 1989 at Future Shock and various other shows. It's interesting to see that they had all this faith in Ric Flair and Sting to be a huge important part of that show, but they still needed the WWF name at the top of the card. They still needed Hogan to be there. And I think WCW may have struggled with that towards the end because they couldn't create their own stars, and those they did create didn't last very long. Austin went to ECW, then WWF. Then you had, Cactus Jack, who came and went a few times. And this is obviously him wearing the US title, which, by the look of it, doesn't have all the paint on it that it's meant to either.
He's purple.
Yes. I mean, one of the things I've always said to you. Well, one of the things I've always said to you is the fact that Sting was WCW's John Cena, and the problem is that Sting evolved. You can see the man in the white shirt showing up at the back. This is a face you're going to recognize. Yeah, Sting, he evolved into the Crow character, whereas John Cena always stayed as Surfer Sting. He never had his massive change. And this Lex Luger, if you are watching along, is a massive deal. And this is a Monday night. This is the first big switch on live television. Lex Luger wrestled for WWF the night before, and he didn't tell British Bulldog. He didn't tell anybody that he was on the card with. And Bischoff didn't want him. Bischoff made a point of saying he did not want to hire Lex Luger. But when your top guy says, can you consider taking my friend in? The first thing he did was he said, right, fine. I'll go and speak to him and see what's happened. When he did speak to him, he found out that, Lex Luger's contract was coming up. He was in a window where he could talk terms. So Bischoff offered...
handshake deal, wasn't it?
What was that?
It was a handshake deal. They kind of expect him to renew, but nothing was set in stone.
Yeah, and one of the issues was Bischoff didn't want him, so he offered him a quarter of what he was on when he left WCW to go to the WWF. Or technically, he went to the WBF, the World Bodybuilding Federation, because he pulled a scam that time as well. Thinking that Lex Luger would turn him down, he could go back to Sting and say, listen, I did ask, but we couldn't financial terms. And Lex Luger said, fine, I'll take it. And Eric's like, well, this is weird, but okay. He then said to Lex Luger, as soon as you're coming in on low terms, obviously if you deliver, then we'll make sure you get a bump every year so your pay goes up. But Lex Luger had a habit of that. Everybody thinks Lex Luger was not interested in wrestling. When you see modern shoot interviews with him, he does look like he cared, but he'd been brought in by Hiro Matsuda, the same person who had hand trained several of the biggest guys in the business, including Hulk Hogan. And he basically said, don't get involved in all the side stuff. Just worry about you. So Lex Luger, interestingly enough, when Ric Flair left WCW, they crowned a replacement champion in Lex Luger, thinking he would carry the company. And when that all bombed, everything was placed on Lex Luger as being completely messed up, ignoring the fact that Lex won the belt, and they couldn't show him holding the belt on camera because it wasn't the big gold belt, because Ric Flair had taken that to WWF. It was a messy situation. One of those interesting stories where you see Vince McMahon was really angry when Alundra Blaze showed up with that belt on Nitro and dumped it in the trash can. But Ric Flair showed up on a WWF show with the big gold belt. So they obviously had a lawsuit. They had to pixelate the belt out. And in the end, WWF basically gave him a modified old tag title. And he carried that down to the ring at shows rather than carrying the big gold. So then he can no longer be sued. They're just alluding to the story as opposed to...
Did I not somewhere that long term he did actually keep a hold of the big gold?
Well, what happened was when you used to win the belt, because its roots is the NWA title. So when you won the NWA title, you put down a cash deposit, which meant that if you refused to lose the title, they would take it off you and keep your deposit. It was an incentive, so you played business. Slight problem. Jim Herd, who wanted to basically change Ric Flair to look like Spartacus at one point, and I'm not even kidding, wanted him to look like Spartacus and have earrings in his ear and everything. And that's when he was like, nah, screw this, I'll go to WWF. Because he'd already previously been minutes away from joining in, I believe it was 1988 or 89, around about the Survivor Series. He was going to be showing up. There's some stories that he was actually the gobbledygooker. He was the mystery egg. But yeah, I mean, with the title, Jim Herd basically said, we're just going to strip you of the title, so just take it back to the office. And Ric Flair said, well, write me a check for the money plus interest, because that's what you did. And Jim Herd said, you know what, you keep the fucking belt. So Ric Flair kept the belt. Ric Flair took that belt to WWF, and I remember as a kid thinking, because we didn't have WCW on TV here anymore, because Worldwide had been on ITV and it got taken off the air. But what we did have was the VHSs. So we could go out to our price and we could buy a WCW VHS. And at one point you could buy 2 for £10, which was incredible. Because I could buy Bash at the Beach and I could buy Starrcade and I could sit and watch 6 hours of wrestling. Although WCW, through Turner Entertainment, would actually edit the pay-per-views. So the 3-hour pay-per-view, when you bought the VHS, would only be 2 hours long instead of 3, which seems like a bit of a con.
I mean, getting back to the match, you can clearly see Sting's strength. One of the things that really impressed me was the fact that he held Rick over above his head on no less than 3 occasions.
I mean, that's
And we're
what
not,
Uncle Lauren showing up as well.
we're not
This is
talking
one
about
of the
just
reasons.
deadlifting.
This is one of the reasons why I compare Sting and John Cena, because you look at them both, and they don't look like they're going to be super strong. They look like, you know, I mean, Cena now is big and muscly, but he was super strong when he was on SmackDown, and he was ruthless aggression.
That's another thing we should probably discuss at some point, is the John Cena big Mark Henry story. You know, strongest man alive, couldn't lift a certain weight, and Cena basically came over and picked it up as though it was a feather.
There's countless stories of people saying that there's something superhuman about John Cena, because he could wrestle for 40 minutes, and then, you know, you think he's not going to have the strength to power slam you, suplex you, whatever, and John's there, he catches you. I can't. His attitude at times apparently sucks. I can't remember ever reading a story about John Cena hurting anybody.
No.
And that's one of the important things. Like, you rarely hear about Sting hurting people. You rarely hear about Ric Flair hurting people. Beyond, you know, things that aren't necessarily Ric's fault. Like, Brett broke his finger when he wrestled Ric Flair in Saskatoon for the WWF Winged Eagle belt. Brett broke his finger, and in the match, he has to pop down and snap it back in place. And when he does, if you watch that match back, you see Mr. Perfect, and he's just like, oh, no, because he knows exactly what Brett's just had to do.
I mean, do you see the bumps that Rick is taking there? It's not flat back. It's not, you know, he knocks it on his shoulder, he knocks it on his hip.
He bumps a little bit on his side, and I don't know if that's something to do with the plane crash that he had in the 80s, which nearly killed him, and it was expected that he wouldn't return.
From what I understood, he always did that because Hunter took after him and started doing it himself.
Well, he never used to before the plane crash, or at least that wasn't his default. But, you know, Rick is from the era where the NWA champion would show up in a car, and the car would open. He'd go out, walk down for his entrance, and when you locked up, it was, "Hey, I'm Rick. How you doing? Hey, my name's John. Shoot me off." And that was how you did matches back then. So Rick didn't know who to trust and who not to trust in the ring. So he would have kind of go-to spots, go-to bits that he would do, knowing that, you know, somebody throws him into the ropes, he can bounce over, and people think they've seen more than they have. It's not an easy spot to do, but people think they've seen more than they have. And if you are watching live, you can see the shell suit jacket that Arn Anderson's wearing. Now, I know you're 10 years younger than me, but trust me, shell suits were cool.
Purple, of course.
Yeah. Purple's not so cool. I did have a purple shell suit once.
But what I loved about that bit just there was that Arn never said anything. He just stands and watches, and Sting approaches him as if to say, right, what's going on? Why are you here? Whose side are you on?
Well, there's a big story here. Ric Flair and Arn Anderson, obviously the Four Horsemen, right? But Sting was a former member of the Horsemen. And everybody thinks, as Horsemen, they're going after Sting. So then obviously there's this altercation where it looks like he's going after Flair, because there's been a feud between the two of them, and they end up fighting. Now, the old Horseman mantra was that you'd build up this, you'd make everybody think that you were feuding, also you could get Sting in the ring on his own and beat him up. But they'd already done that around about the time when they brought RoboCop in to WCW. They brought RoboCop in for a pay-per-view. So, I mean, WCW, Turner, for all their faults, they had access to so many things that were really cool. But there's something about Arn Anderson. I think the first episode of Nitro, having Ric Flair and Sting, it's a nod to the past and a nod to what WCW do. Without
walked back to grab the jacket out the ring.
Of course he did.
Like, he's clearly angry at Rick. He's going after Rick, but it's like, no, I'll pop back and get my shell suit jacket.
But do you not think the person who's angry, that isn't shouting and screaming, that can control it, is actually scarier than, as you can see now, Scott Norton, who's feuding a little bit with the American footballer because, you know, he's like, well, you think you're a tough guy. That's the idea. Scott Norton was a arm wrestler. That was how he got famous. So he got hired in Japan, and his training was very limited. But he learned on the job like you did back in the 90s. Well, back in the right up until the 90s, you learned on the job. So seeing Scott Norton come in the first Nitro was, I didn't watch it at the time. I was looking back on it. And when I did, the first thing I thought was, they put him in a little angle with Macho Man Randy Savage. He's instantly a star. But one of the interesting things here, if you are watching along, you'll be seeing Randy Savage on the top rope right now. Randy Savage
wearing those trousers.
He's wearing red and yellow like Hogan.
Yeah.
I mean, that's... I don't know why. I mean, there's a coolness about Randy Savage that his ring style is great, but his overall demeanor, and this was a big deal at the time. Sabu, who had been in ECW, had worn a Hannibal Lecter mask, had been taken down in like a trolley at various points because Paul Heyman tried to make it out that he was absolutely insane. And one of the interesting things is that he no-showed an ECW show, and Paul Heyman went out and fired him. So when they kind of got back on talking terms, Sabu signed a deal with WCW. But Sabu's a guy who, if he joined WCW in 98 or 99 and been pushed as a big star, he would have been so over. But going in 95, when Nitro was only an hour, and there's very few opportunities to put people on air, I think that really hurt somebody like Sabu, who could have been... I mean, if you think, by 98, WCW had Sandman, Raven, they had Blue Meanie, Stevie Richards, Perry Saturn. They had quite a lot of people who'd come from ECW. They could have done quite a lot with those guys. In the end, what we actually got was some very lame I mean, they changed Sandman's name to Hack, and everybody calls him Hack now. But it was weird. And the man on the left in this here is Mark Merrow. He is somebody who angered Mick Foley in WWF, because right after Nitro started, Mark Merrow joined WWF on a contract that was bigger than Mick Foley's, even though Mick Foley had been main eventing against Undertaker. He'd done a boiler room match, and he was putting his body on the line at all times. What we can see here, you can see the little mascot. Eric Bischoff mentioned the name of that mascot on his podcast, and for the life of me, I can't remember the name of this mascot. So I'll see if I can find out.
I think one of the things that stood out for me about this was the fact that you saw Mean Gene in the ring.
Yeah.
And he seems so underutilized at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, all he'd really done was interviews here and there. But when you move on to the WCW set that we know, basically the metal frame and the metal ramp, and he would do interviews at the bottom of the ramp, I think that would get over now. I think that, if you had, Byron Saxton come out and do interviews, I think that would get massively over. The name of the mascot, by the way, is Wildcat Willie. Wildcat Willie is a weird name.
From the angle, I kind of thought it was a pig.
So the person you're seeing on screen with the dollar sign on him is Michael Wall Street, who had been VK Wall Street and various other gimmicks, Mike Rotunda, IRS. Small test. Who's his son?
It would be... I mean, technically it's Bray Wyatt, but then you've also got his other son, the happy-go-lucky one.
Bo Rotunda.
Indeed.
Yeah. So this is... this is Ray Traylor, Big Boss Man. And one of the interesting things about Big Boss Man is obviously we're big fans of Jim Cornette. We really like his old stuff. And he was Big Bubba. He was the guy who tried to catch Jim Cornette from falling off the scaffolding. That was Big Boss Man.
You want to tell everybody the piece of Big Boss Man merch we own?
Yeah, it's over in the background. I actually have a nightstick, a proper policeman's nightstick, and it's the Big Boss Man's one. It's not a British one because the British ones suck. But yeah, so the reason that Big Boss Man went to WCW was because they had nothing for him, because they wanted to change the shape of the company, new generation, all that nonsense. But Hogan, when he went into WCW, Boss Man was already there, and he became a Hell's Angel. He'd the Guardian, I think his name was, and he basically had several names. But he was one of the guys that Hogan wanted to work with because he knew for a fact that he'd had a run of several months around about the time the Twin Towers were together in WWF, Akeem and Big Boss Man. Big Boss Man and Hogan had several months main event and house shows together. So he knew he could have a match with Boss Man. And Hogan wasn't scheduled for every show at this point. So when Hogan worked, it was a big deal. And Hogan would later exploit the fact that he didn't have to be at every show. And he would take time off when the NFL season started. And then he would come back as sports seasons were finishing so that, ratings would go down when he left and then they'd shoot up when he came back. So it must be Hogan, right? I mean, that's how we look at science if we're British media right now. The person was wearing a white jacket when they got cured of COVID-19. The white jacket must have cured them. Whereas, obviously, there's other factors at play. And with Hogan, he had, cut the pay-per-view money. He had so much financial interest. There's actually an interesting story. One of your favorite wrestlers, Chris Jericho, I believe is the one who told the story of one of his relatives went to buy a Chris Jericho action figure at Walmart. And when he got the receipt, it said Hulk Hogan, which means the merchandise money would go to Hulk Hogan and not Chris Jericho, which just the mind boggles.
I remember hearing that story.
Yes, I mean, was that a screw up on the part of Walmart or was that policy? But then WCW, to be clear, they would send you a FedEx package with a check for your merchandise. So if you had made no money from your merchandise, they would still FedEx you a check for $0.00.
It could have been a retail thing. I mean, obviously we both work in retail, and I know that when we add things to our database, that you have to add them all manually. So it could be quite possible that Walmart simply entered the word Hulk Hogan instead of the word Chris Jericho.
No, yeah, because I mean you see that a lot. People come in to shops and they ask for Coke.
Yeah.
They ask for cola. They don't, And if you say to them, "Oh, it's just here," "Oh no, I mean Pepsi." So it's interesting. I mean, Elastoplast is used instead of plaster. UFC, MMA, WWF, and WWE instead of wrestling. Because I remember when WCW started kind of picking up some publicity, they had Dennis Rodman and a few others. You still had people saying, "Oh, is that WWF stuff?" And that's something that Eric Bischoff had to work really hard with, especially when it's WWF talent that's headlining the shows.
I mean, you can see by looking at the match that Big Bubba's one hell of a seller.
Yeah. I mean, he drifted a little bit after this, and he went back to WWF as it was almost like an evolution of a character. He left as a Big Boss Man, a prison guard, and he came back as a mercenary for hire with the black tactical vests and stuff. I mean, essentially, he looked like the Shield, and that was his job. It was to protect Vince McMahon. So, I mean, like, there's a guy who died way too young, but at the same time, I remember as a kid being super interested in everything Big Boss Man did. I mean, this is old school. If you are watching, when he goes to hit Boss Man, and Boss Man just kind of freezes, and Hogan doesn't hit him, and he ends up just kind of pushing him over like it's the Goonies or something.
Have you seen Jimmy Hart's jacket?
Yes. Is it the airbrush one with Hogan's face on it?
It is, yes. That's fantastic. I would love to have one of them.
He's had several different ones over the years. He used to get them when he was with the Nasty Boys as well.
I
Because
was almost expecting a 619 there, just the way he dropped him over around the ropes. And I'm honestly very surprised by how much turnbuckle and top rope stuff is happening for guys that big.
Bossman, despite his size, was super agile. I mean, if you're looking for a match between two big guys, is it Royal Rumble '93? Where you have Bossman versus Bam Bam Bigelow? Definitely seen that match, Bossman versus Bam Bam Bigelow. And it's two guys who can go, despite the fact that they're both carrying a little bit extra weight. And here's the thing that's interesting for me. Hogan's a babyface and Hogan's cheating.
Literally a way to just say that. I thought Hogan was a babyface at this point. I mean, I know he's got Jimmy Hart on his side. But...
I mean, Jimmy Hart at this point was a good guy. I mean, one of the things with Nitro is they still kept the Saturday show going. But then, obviously, when the NWO came in, the NWO never appeared on the Saturday show. And the reason they never appeared was because it was pre-taped. And the idea is, if we're recording this right now, if all of a sudden, like your sister were to walk in whilst you're recording, we wouldn't leave that in the show. We'd cut it out because we can't. And WCW wanted to put the NWO on the Saturday night show until Scott Hall and Kevin Nash said, well, you would just edit us out. So we just appeared at the live show. And then the second that Hall and Nash didn't appear, then, slowly but surely it just kind of petered away. And that's when at one point, Jimmy Hart, Tony Schiavone were essentially put in charge of the Saturday show. And they just got free reign. They just got to be creative. But they got to work with people like Alex Wright, Hacksaw Jim Duggan. And at various points, I believe they had AJ Styles in there towards the end. So they definitely had a chance to work with some great talent. Is the one thing that really, when you look at Brian Pillman, Jushin Thunder Liger, and it's such a high-paced match to open the show, the contrast, of course, being Ray Traylor and Hulk Hogan. It's such a slow match, although they're a lot more mobile than you would think. It's such a different style. And that's something that WCW were almost like that cavalcade of stars where you had a little bit of everything for everybody. But towards the end, I think the older guys actually hurt WCW. Whereas here, they should have shone light on Hogan and Macho and a few others. And then slowly but surely started bringing up younger guys. Because obviously, in 2 years' time, 3 years' time, you got Bill Goldberg coming in. Bill Goldberg gets over. But then at the same time, Chris Jericho left and became a main eventer for WWF. You have so many guys that worked their asses off in WCW. They almost hit a plateau where they couldn't go any further. And that's why Rey Mysterio was somebody who, they unmasked Rey Mysterio in WCW because they wanted to see his facial reactions. Why not just sell the masks? Look at the money that Vince McMahon made from all those masks.
I believe we have one, don't we?
We do indeed, from Mexico as well. I mean, one of the interesting things Bruce Pritchard always talks about is the idea that win, lose, or draw, Hogan must pose. And here he is posing away. That was the mantra of Vince McMahon, was the idea that it didn't matter. Oh, Bruce the Barber Beefcake, he's not called that anymore. He's called, his name escapes me, but Kevin Sullivan, Kamala, the Dungeon of Doom, there's Earthquake, all ex-WWF guys, and in comes Lex Luger, Haku as well. No way.
Again, I have to reiterate the point that the referee clearly knows what he's doing.
Yeah.
And he places himself, he gets out of the way. The fact that he was on the ropes earlier on really stood out for me, because you don't see that with the WWE guys.
I mean, this is one thing. It's clear this is Luger's first night. He's not positioning himself to focus on the hard camera. That's on WCW to get a secondary camera out there. But still, the fact you can't see Lex Luger's face, for me, actually adds something to it. Because you're getting to see Lex. You can tell from his body how angry he is. Because the promo he cuts, I believe it's on the following Nitro, is I've been to the same places that you've been. And I've been through the same things that you've been through. And now I'm here where the big boys play to take that belt back.
That's actually the promo he cuts on that night.
It's been a while since I watched it.
Yeah. Yeah, he says he doesn't want to play with kids anymore. He's there to play with the big boys. And then Hogan, of course, grants him the match for the next show in Miami, which I also thought was quite impressive because it's for the title. It's not just a, okay, we'll see what you got, kid. It's come and take it from me.
Yeah, and when you look around, there weren't many title shots at that point. It just didn't happen on TV. It was saved for pay-per-view. Although, obviously, having been to WWE shows yourself, they have title matches on the house shows. They just don't acknowledge them on TV.
What I really liked about that segment was the way that the camera pulled out of the conflict diagonally. So it felt as though something was still going on, even though it cut away to the fall brawl.
Yeah, it's almost like you're basically, there is something going on, but it's almost like you're a fan in the audience watching it rather than the camera being right there.
Like stuff hasn't stopped just because you can't see it anymore. And you've got Mean Gene, of course, timidly between the two of them going, right, okay, so who's speaking next?
And the thing is, you look at Mean Gene's reactions. I mean, this is the thing. I didn't appreciate Mean Gene as a kid. I mean, I liked him. He was entertaining. And you didn't realize how much he helped the story. You didn't realize how often guys would be struggling and he would bring them back on what they needed to be on. Because he would know, I mean, from years of doing this, he would know what needed to be said. He has an earpiece, so he's the one in this segment that's going to be giving them the cue that they're going home. So it's quite interesting to know exactly how much information he had.
Where he's saying, you know, I've been in the same place as you've been. I've played with the kids. Now I'm here to play with the boys. I mean, obviously that doesn't sound so great out loud now.
Sounds like Top Gun.
Yeah.
Small secret. Top Gun.
Yeah. You can see even in the background, Macho is watching Luger so intently. Just, you know, like, if he moves, I move.
Yeah, because it's this idea that he's an outsider. And this is Sting's friend. So Macho knows that's Sting's friend. So he knows that if Hogan and Luger fight, Sting's going to get involved. And not maybe to attack Hogan, but you know, it's, the way that this story was told is massively underrated. I do think that there's a lot of work WCW could have done to build the undercard. There's no denying this first episode, that 45 minutes, because we didn't have adverts, it's flown by. You can't get the same today.
I think the show benefited quite a lot from the fact that they had the Mr. Wall Street promo, because it was that mid-card injection that made the main event just seem that bit bigger.
Yeah. When 5 Star Wrestling was on here in the UK, I do remember when we watched the first episode, and then there was a lot of technical issues. But when we watched it, and they did a reasonably good job of establishing the people that we needed to see. And that's something that I really do like. There was a period around just before Christmas time where I actually did see Raw were actually doing quite a lot of things to get people over. And a lot of fans on Twitter were complaining that Raw wasn't very good. And I'm like, wait a second, this is a show that's telling us Buddy Murphy is over, Drew McIntyre's over, Ricochet's over, Cedric Alexander's over. They were putting these people and saying, these are the guys to watch. And they did such a great job of it. And then Vince McMahon came along and said, I don't like Ricochet, I don't like Cedric Alexander, so they're not going to get pushed anymore.
Are we going to comment on the dog?
Well, you can. I believe the dog's called Beefy.
I love the fact that when they've come away from the conflict, the way that they've framed onto the commentary table, it's not just at the front where the commentary team are just talking to you. It feels off to the side where they're having a conversation and we're kind of listening in.
What's kind of fun for me with some of the early Nitros, and they did kind of get away from it later on, was the fact that you opened on the announcers a lot of times and they told you what was coming. And that's what Raw used to be as well. Back in 97 and 98, Jim Ross would open up and say, by God, we got a Hell in a Cell tonight. Oh, God damn it. you would see that the person telling you about the matches was excited, and you got a little bit hyped.
I mean, that's something that I felt this lacked a little bit, was that there was no official match announcements. And really, if you are a casual fan, as opposed to having seen these guys elsewhere, you wouldn't know who was in the ring. I had that trouble a handful of times where I didn't realize Big Bubba was, of course, Big Bubba.
Yeah.
Until someone said, I went, oh, I know he's X, Y, and Z from, whatever.
And do you think that that's a good thing for WCW? Do you think having those WWF names was good for them?
I definitely think so. I think that you have to have some placeholders there to set the show up, and then build your undercard to sort of not take the place, but step into those shoes. What's lacking just now, I think, with AEW is the fact that they had a ton of names that people only really know if they're watching religiously, or if they watch 20 different shows on 50 different websites.
And it assumes that everybody's watching everything.
Yeah, and there's no real character development for the single show. And again, although this is the first show for Nitro, it did benefit a lot from the fact that there wasn't as much play-by-play for the matches. The commentary told you what you needed to know, and then left you to watch the match and figure out for yourself what was going on.
A lot of that would have also been the lack of ability for Eric Bischoff. I mean, it's a very weird decision for me that Eric Bischoff was the boss. He had Tony Schiavone at his disposal, and he stuck himself on as the lead announcer. I mean, he had Bobby Heenan at one side, so Bobby's going to guide anybody through a show. But then he had Steve Mongo McMichael on the other that he has to guide through a show. And I think that did hurt for a while.
The commentary there for me seemed a bit forced between McMichael and Heenan. I mean, obviously Heenan's notorious for kind of pushing buttons a little bit. But it seemed as though they were trying to create some banter where there wasn't any there. They were trying to play against each other where it was clear that they would just sit in a pub and have a pint together.
Yeah, and that's the thing. When you saw Raw move to the three-man team where they had Dio Madden, Vic Joseph, and Jerry Lawler, I really liked the dynamic of Vic Joseph and Dio Madden, having seen them on Main Event. Jerry Lawler, when he returned, hadn't been doing any commentary for a while. He was outdated. His lines were very passé. But after a little while, Jerry found out that, he doesn't need to, scream puppies every 10 minutes to be over. Jerry Lawler is over because he's Jerry goddamn Lawler. Be Jerry Lawler. Sometimes he's going to root for the bad guy just because that's who he is. So when they moved Dio Madden off and they started having the revolving door of Samoa Joe, and then every now and again if somebody else show up, I really liked Samoa Joe in commentary. And I think the fact that we know who these people are really helps them, and we kind of forgive the mistakes. I don't think Steve Mongo McMichael got that. I don't think he got the chance to make the mistakes because he perhaps did WCW have enough training for him before he went in and did that show. Because I remember the first time you did radio with me, it took you a while to loosen up, and then 3-4 shows down the line, you were able to take on a bigger role. And it wasn't that you weren't capable the first time, just you needed to figure out what you were when you were doing it.
Fair, you did drop me in at the deep end without telling me. We're sat there having a chat whilst there's some music playing, and you just turn my mic on and go, right, so go on, say something.
Yeah. I mean, the easiest way to learn is to just do it. So when it comes to watching Nitro, what did you think? Now, obviously, Nitro went to being 3 hours, and people said that the 3 hours was what killed Nitro because people just got drained and tired. And people said it was about making extra money for WCW, but they got no money. They didn't get TV rights fees because WCW was owned by the network. The TNT was Ted Turner. Ted Turner was WCW. They shifted quite a lot of debt from other companies, other sections and departments onto WCW because it was the redheaded stepchild. Do you think that the 3 hours for Raw is really part of the problem that WWE's having? Because when we watch NXT, when we watch even SmackDown to a degree, as a 2-hour show, it's almost blink and you miss it for some reason. But with the 3-hour show, you're getting to the end of that second hour and you're like, oh my God, we haven't even seen the champion yet. The tag titles haven't been out yet. And it's just, for me, I think that WCW, you can't do a 1-hour show anymore as your A show. Do you think time is important? Do you think time helped WCW here?
Well, I certainly think, you look at, I believe it was Raven's hot air balloon principle, where you've got, you build your audience up, you take them back down a bit, and you need the time to sufficiently balance that.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, like for example with Nitro just now, with that adverts that was 45 minutes, and I felt that I could have comfortably watched that for 2 hours and not been bored. Like they wouldn't have had much filler in between. Yeah. However, when I first started watching it and the Liger Pillman match went 10 minutes, I thought, wow, Liger Pillman are getting 10 minutes. They could have wrapped this up in 6.
Yeah. Especially when you look at how the
match is there.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'm thinking now, as you're saying this, is I've got a great idea for what next week's project, not homework, it's a project. Next week's project should be WCW.
Well, I'll be fair, I haven't done that much work this week because of your, I'm going to say monologue. Interesting tidbits and backstory.
Anytime you want to throw stuff in, it's good. But I have an idea that came to me whilst we were talking. Now, we've mentioned the man. Now, I'm a fan of the man I'm going to speak about. He's insulted me to my face almost. But Vince Russo.
To be fair, a lot of people insult you because you tend to have conversations with them on Twitter that end up being a little more honest than I think they expect. Amishman, keep an eye out.
Throw me out in the cold when it was January. It was freezing. Yeah. He didn't care.
With a hot toddy.
So this is my idea. You just watched the first Eric Bischoff Nitro, right, from 1995. So I'm going to give you 2 options, and we'll see which one you decide. Because I haven't told you this, because I just thought about it. Because these things happen with me. 2 options. Would you rather your next week's project to watch be Vince Russo's first episode of Nitro, where he actually has his writing partner of Ed Ferrara? Or would you rather watch the episode where Vince Russo and Eric Bischoff work together on screen? They actually have Vince Russo on screen for the first time, and Eric Bischoff returns to the company after being put on furlough. So which option would you prefer? The first episode that Vince Russo is officially in charge of, where we get to see the introduction of basically the NSYNC ripoff with Hurricane Helms, 3 count. You get to see people like well, I won't go too much into it to prevent spoilers. But Vince Russo obviously tries to make it almost like a version of Raw. Or do we fast forward 3-4 months where Russo has been in charge whilst they've cut Nitro from 3 hours to 2. So there's obviously a slight revenue change there. But then when he got sent home, they had Kevin Sullivan and a few other people booking it, and it was rubbish. So they put the phone call out. Vince Russo, you're still under contract. Come back in, and you'll work with Eric Bischoff. And Vince Russo was like, well, actually, I'm intrigued by that. I'd like that. Eric Bischoff basically said, I don't want to work with Vince Russo. But let's try it out, see what happens. So if you choose option 1, we're watching the creative team that led to the Attitude Era in WWF going into WCW and seeing what impact they have on night 1. The second option is seeing what happens when Vince Russo and Eric Bischoff work together both on screen and off. Because if we go with option 1, we can see an almost instant change in WCW with characters changing and storylines changing. Whereas if we go with option 2, we can discuss a lot of the ideas about the fact that Eric Bischoff, as well as being creative, also acted as almost an agent for Hulk Hogan. So which one would you prefer?
I think I'm going to go chronologically and do option 1 first.
Okay, so we're going to go with Vince Russo first.
Yeah, for me, it makes the most sense after having watched a Bischoff Nitro to then watch a Russo Nitro and move on to the one that they do together as a comparison point.
So you think next week we'll do the Russo one, and then the week after we'll do the one where on screen Russo and Bischoff actually create. We have the New Blood versus the Millionaires Club, and we actually steal something from a film that was out at the time called Saving Private Ryan, which is the term FUBAR. Do you know what FUBAR is?
I do, but I don't think I can say it on the recording.
I don't think we're gonna get kicked off of YouTube for saying fucked up beyond all recognition. So Russo liked to pull from movies, so he had fuck you, Bischoff, and Russo. There you go. There's your pointless piece of trivia. So next week, your homework, the first Vince Russo episode of Monday Nitro. How did you find doing today's show? Because normally you're doing kind of almost your own section on the podcast. Last week you had your own section as well.
It's basically been the same, if I'm perfectly honest. I've sat and learned a lot from you, having lots of backstory. I got some opinions in here and there. But, you know, it's fun.
If you want to be more vocal next week, absolutely feel free. So thank you for joining us. And I think rather than us doing a big proper end to the show with one of us, how about if I just hand over to you and I let you end the show this week? Because you did last week's end. So you should do this one.
I only did last week's end because you decided to go for a nap.
I had just spent like 40 minutes interviewing a guest. So
yeah, but we're now into an hour and 15 and you're still awake. So do your job. I did the homework. I watched the show. I took my notes.
Fine. See, this is what happens when you're married and you happen to do a podcast together and then you end up in lockdown, so you have to do it on video. Right. Thank you for joining us this week. Hopefully you did some form of watch along, or you just enjoyed the fact that we were talking lots. But we will see you next week, where Zoe Styles is going to get to watch the first Vince Russo episode of Monday Nitro. To be honest, you are in for one hell of a ride.
Slightly, and you can see our wrestling belts on the wall there.
And that's not even all of them. We will do an episode where we go through some of the memorabilia that we have.
I mean, it's no Castle Cornet, but we can
dream
things in here.
We can dream. Okay, thank you for joining us. Give us a like in this general vicinity. Send us a message, whatever the message bit is. Find us on Facebook.
Talk Wrestling 24/7, 3 a.m. Send him a Twitter and he'll get back to you.
Yes. My Twitter is Amishman84. I have 2 Twitters, one of which I've now deleted. So Amishman84, and you will find that it is a picture of a wrestler who looks remarkably like this, but is actually the Gambler from WCW. Yes, I'm that much of a geek. I found a wrestler that looks kind of like me, and he's not an Anderson. But thank you for joining us. Say goodbye, Zoe.
Goodbye, everybody. Have a good evening.